It's a really worthwhile experience to try and prompt some of these base models. And the more you do this sort of thing, the more you learn to recognize sort of like the patterns and what the model does and doesn't understand. We're writing a bunch of code that takes a bunch of forms and it produces a bunch of other forms. And this is exactly the job of bureaucrat. We're just doing it at scale. The professional class is just a bunch of bureaucrats. It's the people who could read. All they do all day is take forms and fill out other forms. And since we've automated this is why so much wealth has been accruing to the tech industry, is because we've just automated bureaucracy at scale. We've already seen in the sort of like post-2008 world that people have less stable careers, and I think this is going to make that a little bit worse. I think you're going to have some expectation that you're going to need to change hats quite a bit, and you're going to do some job for a little while, and then you're going to be like, this all of the interesting bits have been automated. Now you have a completely different job for a little while, and like that level of flexibility, I think for people, for the labor side, for the people who are looking for jobs, I think is something to keep in mind and strive for. The model simulates the smartest human that's ever been on the internet, and then throws it at the problem. That's the reasonable age model of AGI. But as you get smarter than that, as you approach superintelligence, you actually have to convince the model not to sandbag. Getting the model to do what you want means doing something that is good for society instead of bad for society, good for the user instead of bad for the user. But it also means convincing the model to actually do the damn thing.
Today I'm speaking with Anish Tondwalkar. Anish is a former employee of OpenAI and Google Brain, which has now been merged into Google DeepMind. He's also the co-founder of dmodel.ai, a Y-Combinator-backed startup working to open the black box of modern large language models like ChatGPT in order to understand how they work internally. He also advises investors on trends and applications of emerging AI technologies. Anish, since ChatGPT made an enormous splash in when it was released in 2022, I think almost everybody would have, or certainly listening to this, will have tried large language models, maybe to do some cooking or make me a short poem about something, this kinds of nature, but probably tried to integrate it into their work in some fashion, and found that it wasn't really applicable, didn't really give them the depth of the answers that they were after. But I think at the same time, and a lot of the people that I've talked to, even here in Berkeley, the recent conference we both attended, people from outside the Silicon Valley bubble don't understand that there's actually been not just a difference in kind in the last 6 months or so, but a difference in degree. That we now have this a new generation of models, reasoning models that can significantly improve answer quality, particularly on quite complex questions. So, can you tell us how should we be thinking about this latest generation of models?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to understand is that about the old school pre-trained models is that they are trained on all the text on the internet just to be generally intelligent. So if you ask the model any question like, why is the sky red? If you why is the sky blue? It's going to say, it's going to give you an explanation of scattering physics. So the way it does this is because it knows everything that's been said, and then uses that information in order to immediately put out an answer. This has a number of disadvantages, and the primary among which is that it doesn't get to think first. It's and you can see some improvement in these classic models just by asking it to think step by step. Mm-hmm. So it'll take some time, and in front of you, it'll think a little bit, and just telling it to do that already causes an improvement in how the model works.
Sure.
And so you see improvement performance on a bunch of tasks.
Right. So just kind of outlining this a little bit for people. I know Andre Karpathy kind of talks about these classical AI models as essentially being something of like a compression of the internet. It's one way perhaps people can think about it. So if the answer is there in that compression, then hopefully when you query, or more generally, it's in the kind of latent space, one was what kind of technical way of thinking about it, but it's like between answers that have already been given on the internet somewhere, like maybe a poem that's in the style of, between Shakespeare and Blake or something. It can kind of interpolate between these two things and give you a poem that's kind of like a pastiche of these two kind of styles. But if it's not if it's a question that's not on the internet, it's a kind of novel in some sense, then it fails. But as you say, people were kind of getting better at saying, okay, well, if you take some time, to reason through. People tended to get better answers, but now we're looking at a kind of a new generation that sort of does this automatically and does it more rigorously.
Yeah. So the classic pre-trained models, you can ask them to think step by step, and it'll do it. Because it's seen examples of people thinking step by step on the internet, and so it'll copy that and give itself a little bit more time to think.
Sure.
But these reasoning models, they've been trained specifically to do that. So the longer you train a reasoning model on more of these reasoning tasks, the model learns to use more and more steps in order to arrive at a correct answer. And so this means the model is learning to take more steps, but also that it's learning more intelligently how to take and compose these steps together. So if I ask it to solve a math problem, a pre-trained model will sort of immediately guess at the answer. A reasoning model will stop and try to work through each of the steps that are needed to arrive at the answer. And so when we do these reasoning training runs, what we do is we train the model how to understand which step comes after which one and how to compose them together. So like if I'm solving a simple algebraic equation, say I've got 2x plus 3 equals 10. The model is going to need to subtract off the 3 from both sides. It's going to need to divide by 2. And it needs to not only know that these are the steps that it needs to take, but it also needs to know that having taken the previous one, we've got 3 here, now we've moved it to one side. You've got the 2 that you're dividing by. It's like which pieces of the previous state of the problem do we need to apply this step to?
Right. So previously, you've got this algebraic equation, and then from the very first token, it's just going I think the answer's 8 or something vaguely plausible. Whereas now, reasoning models are specifically trained to take their time, work their way through this problem in order to arrive at a more kind of concrete answer. So one of the things I find interesting about this latest generation of reasoning models is that they're not just thinking kind of through step by step in the sense of okay, we're going to break down this algebraic equation, but they also trained in a range of ways to check their own reasoning as well. So they might think through, you give them a complex problem, they might think to themselves, okay, let's check the legal code first, and then we'll do this. And they're also able to search the internet and so on. But then they'll kind of arrive at some answer, and then, see this very consistently. We'll go, okay, let's see if we approach this from a different angle. Let's approach this from a different angle. They'll start almost again from first principles in a way, but looking at, okay, well, what about, are there any times that this has happened before? And some base rate type thing, and work their way through. And then if they arrive at the same kind of answer twice, then they begin to print out the answer to you. So you're getting a lot more capability and mileage out of it when it comes to complex problems that need to be unpacked a bit.
Yeah, this sort of search-like, backtracking-like behavior. It's in the DeepSeek guys call it an aha moment, where both the model itself for them said aha. Let me try this other approach, and that for them as well was an aha moment. Where they're like, okay, we see why the reasoning is working. Because at this point in time, if you remember, OpenAI had released O1, it's the sort of first reasoning model that everyone got access to. And
so at this point in time, that was last year, right? Late last year?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And so this was right after the O1 release, and DeepSeek started doing their reasoning training.
But the O1, again, most people, sorry to interrupt you, but most people perhaps would never have used that because it was behind a paywall, right?
Right, yeah.
Anyhow.
Yeah, but I think obviously the DeepSeek guys had, right? If you're at any of the AI labs, you want to keep up to date with what everyone else is doing.
Sure.
And if you look at their previous work, they'd been working along this route anyways, right? So they had this DeepSeek prover paper where they were working on reasoning for math problems back in the DeepSeek 1.5 days, before DeepSeek v3 and DeepSeek R1, which is their version of O1. And I think they sort of suspected that there was something interesting here. But I think once you have one of the labs releasing a model like O1, then it's becomes apparent that this sort of thing will work. And so once this this sort of thing will work, then you just start throwing tons of GPUs at it, and trying out what works. And I think probably for them, when they saw the model go aha, and they went aha, they realized okay, this is how reasoning works, is that it lets the model do all of these sorts of things.
Yeah, and I'm really interested in the way in which this allows AI to really tackle a lot more complicated problems and more complex problems that are outside of the sort of window of what previously you could sort of rely upon these classical models to do. And I'm thinking here of things like, can you translate this text from one to another? Like incredible capabilities that if we're talking now like as if it's passé, but like still, and I think we're still, even in the realm of properly applying the kind of GPT-4 classical model to society, is still like a lot of mileage there. But we're talking about situations where you could draft a document pretty easily, like give me a kind of 4-page strategic document about parking, and it would kind of do a decent job. Or you could edit things, you can really process text data a lot, like more quickly, automate a lot of kind of simple processes like sentiment analysis and so on, and begin, I think, the way I think of it is like the beginnings of like an Excel type program in a way, but for text, where previously, not everything has to be done by hand anymore or in a word processor. We can begin to like automate some basic sorts of tasks. But this kind of always struggled, at least in my experience, to kind of tackle really like real world situations where there's not necessarily like an easy answer to them. You have to kind of think through them a little bit. And we seem to be kind of coming into that state now. But, there's still challenges, right? Like I think one of which is just like the context itself, not so much the length of it, but it's just like every real world situation is just like, if you really stop to think about it and explain it to how you might to like a really intelligent kid, what it is that I'm doing at work step by step, it's like very high context, oh well, there's this kind of office drama that I need to deal with, and like I work like with an organization with this kind of structure, and there's all kinds of like things that are relevant to just me, and then I need to be able to you get much better results even on classical models of just like outlining, like I think people need to be writing much longer prompts, for example, about exactly what it is that they want and the sorts of situations they find themselves in order to begin to get like better answers. That'd be kind of fair to say. That was a long question.
Yeah, so I'm going to start in the middle of the question and then
Great.
and then branch out wherever I want. I'm going to have some fun
Excellent.
with it.
Perfect.
But I think the Excel analogy is actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's a very interesting way to look at it, because Excel is this like extremely mature like user interface for dealing with even like very technical matters. I think it's the only really deep power user interface that we have that's accessible to even like the random guy off the street who's never like touched a computer. You're like, okay, I don't know how to use a computer. You put him in front of a computer for the first time. I don't know. You raise him in a bubble where he's never seen a computer.
Sure.
You put him in front of this thing. You're like, okay, here's a keyboard and here's a spreadsheet. And if he's like an accountant, then it's like he's like, oh yeah, I know how to use this. Like it's
Right.
just like on paper, and it's just so intuitive.
Sure.
And so in the programming language community, actually, we have we like to say that like Microsoft Excel is the most used programming language on the world.
Sure.
And
it's Turing complete too nowadays, right?
Yeah,
like
exactly.
It's
They've got
actually, you can do anything.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily an efficient way to do most like a more complex task, but yeah, you can do anything you like in it.
Yeah, and I think this is the point, is that like you can do. I mean, I've seen people do use it for accounting, obviously, but they use it for like D&D character sheets. They use it for basically any task on a computer that like needs any sort of like I think you could really take anything you wanted and structure it in Microsoft Excel, and it would probably be a reasonable interface for it.
Mm-hmm.
If you weren't, I mean, if we ended up magically losing like every developer like overnight, and we're like, okay, we need to continue to develop applications, everyone just writes everything in Microsoft Excel. It's probably how this works. Like, I mean,
Sure.
this is how certain industries actually function, right?
Finance, for
Exactly,
example,
yeah.
like enormous amount, I think, of the modern world runs on Excel, right? Like,
Yeah, I have a friend who started at like some he's like did some consulting work for some small fully systematic trading shop, and their strategies. I mean, it was like a low frequency sort of, but like their strategies were like in a Microsoft Excel sheet, and the way it would work is that like they had like a script that like fetched the financial data from the market, put it into a Microsoft Excel sheet, ran the Microsoft Excel sheet, and then put it out. But sorry, this is a different version.
digression a little bit, but it's obviously a very powerful thing. It's very intuitive, and you can use it very simply to process primarily, and it can do a little bit of text here and there with concatenation and so on, but primarily the real power of it is dealing with numerical data. But then I guess the at least by analogy, I think it seems to me that even just kind of these classical models that we talked about earlier, we haven't, as far as I can have seen, we haven't seen that kind of super intuitive integration with an Excel yet. Yeah. I've seen some add-ons for sheets and so on that enable.
I think it's important to be careful here to distinguish the metaphor from the map is not the territory.
Sure,
here.
fair enough.
We're a long way, like you're saying, we're a long way from the Microsoft Excel era of large language models where you just use them. I mean, chatbot interfaces are great, but I don't think they don't scale.
Right.
On the flip side, so there is a Claude Google Sheets, Claude Excel plugins that allow you to use these things on text data and in Sheets and do these sorts of transformations. And I think that's actually a very fun, interesting use case. But I don't think it scales at this point,
right?
Because there's I think it's very easy to understand how to put numbers and unstructured and sort of semi-structured data in spreadsheets and databases. But I still don't think we really understand the structure of information we really want for these sorts of chatbot type, LLM type transcripts.
Right. But I guess I do think though that the promise is there, and doing it at scale is a struggle for sure. But in general, I think it's probably relatively small snippets of text data of text of one form or another can now be processed more automatically. The kind of the low level tasks process type tasks that maybe previously required a human being to sort of, because it's we were taking this piece of information, maybe it's stored in on a literal piece of paper. Now you can and it has to be copied into this format and this data set, but there's some variations there in the way that it how long the text string is and what kind of information. Maybe sometimes there's variations in that space, and we need to kind of understand. Okay, somebody's said a whole bunch of stuff, there's a human being in the loop somewhere, in the bureaucracy, that's kind of not making any decisions about what that data means for business processes, but rather processing it in a kind of Excel-like fashion and turning that into some other kind of data. This particular submission was negative and opposed the process, or this particular submission raised these three key points. That kind of thing, where it's the kind of thing that if it were numbers, we would already be doing, but in Excel, extracting pieces of that numerical data. But now that we have these classical tools really allow us to kind of do that low-level processing of that kind of unstructured text data, you could call it, but or just people writing stuff and turning it into things that are a summary or what have you. So I think people are pretty familiar with this, but we're yet to see it disperse through legacy institutions and kind of outside of Silicon Valley. It's still, I think, GPTs are, or LLMs more generally rather, are kind of in the zeitgeist. Some people use them and are kind of becoming significantly more productive as they experiment with different kinds of ways. But in general, the idea of this is just, of course you use Excel, everybody uses Excel. We're yet to kind of have that application of of course everybody uses of GPT or an LLM for this kind of task. Even in the kind of classical model. Is that kind of fair to say?
I think I've got two things to say here, really. I think one is I sort of on the general sort of like the more abstract question of like automating, digitizing bureaucracy, and then on sort of like the specific LLM, how LLMs might fit into this workflow. Because one thing I've said a lot is that software engineers are modern bureaucrats. Is that we're doing bureaucracy at scale. Because when you think about if you look, there's a joke about Google. It's Sergey and Larry's protobuf moving company, and protobuf is just like, it's basically a data structure that holds a bunch of data, like it's like a form, right? And so the idea is that we're writing a bunch of code that takes a bunch of forms and it produces a bunch of other forms, and this is exactly the job of bureaucrat. We're just doing it at scale. And if you look at historically, right, like who like the professional class is just a bunch of bureaucrats. It's the people who could read, and all they do all day is take forms and fill out other forms. And since we've automated this is why so much wealth has been accruing to the tech industry, is because we've just automated bureaucracy at that scale. And I think that's a big part of what we do as engineers.
Sure. Okay. That's a rather low status way of putting it,
Yeah, I think it's important to tear, just like, all right, what's like, if the ancient Romans were doing this, what would they do, right? I think like it's really hard to learn from history when it comes to new technologies, and you have to like try really hard to be like, okay, if we strip out all of the things that make this cool, like what's the most boring way we could imagine this, and then you can see the patterns throughout history of like all of the other things that people have done that have been like this.
Right. Okay.
But to push this analogy forward, right? So right now we've got so like on the numerical side, on the financial data, all that sort of side, you scale from like an Excel sheet to like a Microsoft Access database to like Databricks, and so you've got this like sort of continuum of things that are like, okay, this is one person on a computer, a professional who's not a software specialist, up to like you've got databases.
Right, and this largely this distinction is depending on just how big the like data set you're working with is, right?
There's two big reasons you scale outside of an Excel sheet, right? Is the first is that you get too much data, like you said. The other is that the logic becomes too complex to maintain in an Excel VB script, and you need like an actual software engineer to get to it.
Sure.
And so this is how we handle this sort of like very straightforward form filling, very structured data. And when we get slightly less structured, we have this sort of like Databricks, Google, Palantir, like where you just like you've got a form, you need to fill out another form. Here's how you write the business logic that does that transformation.
Right.
And so all of this like software engineering business logic often does amount to like taking a form and filling out another form. And so how does this relate to LLMs? Well, on one level, I've gotten a little distracted, but on another, I think it's actually very related. So when we think about like what would it mean for Excel like interfaces for LLMs, right? It means something that users can, like, you can take a guy off the street and you can say, hey, here's an LLM, or here's my LLM application that like, here's my Excel for LLMs. And in it, you can just sit there and build whatever workflow you need in order to interact with this text unstructured data that's just like a bucket of text, and produce whatever you need, right? And so this is like, I think this is sort of the layman's version of this like automated bureaucracy at scale with software engineers. So you're taking the sort of task that most software engineers do, and this is sort of the analogy of the database in the Excel world. And now we're going to be able to create like sort of an Excel for this thing where like a normal person can have the ability to create software with the ease of writing an Excel spreadsheet. Right.
I think the point what I see here is that the user interface is like still very rudimentary. Most of the emphasis has been on advancing the like capabilities of the models themselves, but that even pre-reasoning models, I would say, like you've got this kind of like baseline set of capabilities there that I think are still largely unapplied. Maybe that's partly because of the UI. Maybe that's partly because of just like.
I think it might be useful for me to just say a few more words about how I think this UI is going to develop.
Sure.
Yeah, because I think right now, I think the one powerful way we have of using large language models is what we call language model programs, where you take in you have a language model, it takes in some input, it runs it through some prompt that produces another answer, and then based on that, it branches and decides what the next prompt is. So you've got a program with control flow that determines what all the next steps are, and everything here is controlled by a language model. You've also seen this. You might also see this go under the name of like agent workflows and so on.
Right. So you give it some high-level task. Can you book me a restaurant? That's a kind of a classic one. and then maybe under the hood writing a program of sorts.
But the crucial thing here is that in this sort of like agent workflow or language model program, a lot of this logic is dictated by the human beforehand, right? So you've got some understanding of your domain, some business logic that you want to push into to language model land, but you don't know exactly all of the details. You can't you don't understand it at the level where you could write a program, or you're just like not a software engineer and you can't write a program. But you don't understand it at the level where you can say, okay, I'm going to take this, I'm going to take like the user's question, I'm going to run like some sort of natural language understanding to understand what they're asking. And since I'm like, say I'm like Expedia, right? I'm like, okay, the user asked me, they want to book a flight from the US to Japan, San Francisco to Japan, that fits with their calendar, that fits within their price budget, right? And so as Expedia, if I'm writing an agent for this, right, I might say, okay, I want to extract the destinations and date ranges and so on, and then run a search, right? And so instead of just giving this to like O3 and saying, hey, here's a API for their calendar and for Expedia and here's the query, this might be a little bit more difficult for the model to handle. Instead, what we do is we break this down into like, okay, here are the interesting things. Like, I want you to extract this piece of information, use that information to connect to the calendar and to connect to all of these things in order to produce an answer. Now, in this simple example, O3 might just be able to handle it with some computer using and with the appropriate APIs. But as you scale up, you start to have more interesting facts about your domain that are either not in the pre-training set or like poorly represented in the pre-training set or sort of out of distribution for the model that you would need to specify.
Maybe it's knowledge cutoff date is these models will be trained at a particular time, then they only have data up within their training set up to like June 2024, and anything since then is like unknown to it, as one example of the sort of thing you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think we're both probably pretty agreed that there's some kind of combination, just like of pre-reasoning models. There's some combination here of like, as a consequence of poor UI or still developing UI, where it's just not like intuitive for people, or there's some kind of integration with another kind of tool or what have you that's still being done. So either some combination of that, of UI, or just like, humans haven't adapted to these models yet. But I think like, and I'm just trying to generalize here, but I think that there's a whole host of tasks, whether it's translation, we've talked about those kind of like these simple like booking type tasks, with summarization, these kinds of like relatively low cognitive overhead type things, which the models already do really well. And that, with a bit of work and maybe organizations developing their own kind of like internal culture of understanding how to prompt things properly or what have you, that these kinds of things are gonna be increasingly able to be handled and will be handled by institutions. Just coming back to this idea of reasoning models, I think are almost there's a different thing happening here, or different kinds of tasks, different kinds of things that a reasoning model can do for institutions, for decision makers and so on, which is like increasingly to be an assistant, a sounding board for like complex ideas. There's like this whole host of things which, a year ago, you asked the AI about something or other, and it's just going to give you this very bland, generic answer that's like an intern could have written, let's say. Increasingly, it sort of feels like, okay, you're looking at something like an intermediate employee, like that's got some like subject matter expertise that has worked its way through kind of problems like this before, that are kind of not immediately obvious that you can just answer at a snap, but you have to kind of think about a little bit, and thus it opens up like a whole host of like realm of really collaboration in a way with AIs. Would that be kind of a fair way to sort of describe this kind of capabilities of this new reasoning set?
I think one thing to be careful about is that when we talk about a lot of like the domain specific capabilities of reasoning models are sort of spiky in the way that they're like very good at a couple of things, and then they're good at the things that are sort of around there, but they don't have the sort of same smooth general capabilities of these pre-trained models that we're used to.
Okay.
So for example, DeepSeek, they train their reasoning model R1 on a series of math and coding problems. And so this means the model gets much better at math and coding. And then other things that benefit from the sort of reasoning you learn how to do in order to solve math and coding problems also improve. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they improve at every sort of domain-specific, step-by-step task.
Right. So like first principles, so they might get better at like engineering problems, for example, as a result of this, but possibly no better at like social dynamic type stuff, which is just like completely out of the scope of the sorts of things that they've been highly trained on. Would that be?
So I think it's actually kind of hard to predict which ones are gonna where you're gonna get this transfer, because what is the model actually learning in this reasoning training run is, I think, not like a super obvious question, and it's one that I'm aiming to answer with interpretability.
Right.
But I think what's the model actually learning is that a lot of these, it's learning concepts during pre-training, and then it's learning how to put them together during when it's doing these reasoning trainings. And so when I just like abstractly, it's like don't stare at that too hard. I don't know if it holds up under scrutiny, but I think it's a good way to think about it.
Right.
And so like when you learn how to put things together, right? So you learn how to put bits of mathematical information together in order to solve a math problem. And sometimes this does look very similar to like, legal analysis, where you're like, I've got 3 arguments. How do I take this argument and put that argument together? I think that's a sort of a similar thing. And so I think there is some sort of like general reasoning principles that you learn from any of these domains and you apply to different domains. And this can apply even in sort of social dynamics, asking social dynamics questions, where it's like, I think like pre-trained models have like a very deep understanding of human psychology, I think. If you look at some of these champion level prompters on Twitter, like Janice and his friends, they have this, like, they're almost talking to pre-trained models like two psychotherapists talking to each other. It's like Freud having a conversation with Freud. It's very interesting.
They're managing to elicit kind of shaped poems, like into the shape of a fish, and spirals of like increasing like poetic depth.
It's not just the jailbreaks, right? So some of these, like Janice had access to GPT-4 base, which I think by the way, it's a beautiful model. I think it's kind of a tragedy that most of humanity is not going to ever get able to talk to GPT-4 base. I think it's a great time. But the closest thing that people can do is they can talk to Llama 405B base, which I think is still an interesting base model. Different characteristics.
So just for the audience, like a base model is the one that hasn't yet been, hasn't gone through fine tuning in order to become an assistant. Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
These models basically will, so they're trained, they're compression of the internet, but they haven't yet had that sort of user assistant. They don't think of themselves as a separate entity, by analogy or anything like this. They just start with whatever the end of the prompt was, and then just like keep going in this sort of like chain of thought, like a James Joyce novel kind of like. They're
pure next spoken predictors. So,
right. So you could say, please tell me about such and such, like chocolate, and then it will answer as if it was you, like, please tell me about chocolate. I wish to know about chocolate. Blah 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 blah. Yeah. Chocolate is wonderful. It's a very kind of.
I think at this point you can find base models hosted for Llama 4 and DeepSeek as well.
Right. Okay.
I don't know. This is, I think, the one I point to by default is the big Llama 3 model.
Okay. All right. But so rather fun, and it'll give you a bit of an insight that they're not necessarily particularly useful in some respects, so you have to really understand how to prompt them in order to get useful like results out of them. But anyway.
Yeah, but for anyone who's interested in the technology, I think it's a really worthwhile experience to try and prompt some of these base models. And it's going to be really frustrating the first couple of times. You'll ask, why is the sky blue? And it'll say, why is the sky red? And it's like, it's this list of questions. But eventually you get, the following is a explanation of why the sky is blue, and then it fills it in.
Sure.
But the more you do this sort of thing, the more I think the more you learn to recognize sort of like the patterns and what the model does and doesn't understand.
Yeah. Yeah. And I really always try to encourage people to play and to just try out different kinds of prompts and so on. And I've given lectures to mayors in Africa and various other things of like just breaking down like in different kinds of contexts, what sorts of things work, where does it fail? Like we were talking about math problems earlier. Like the more that you play with it, the more you kind of can develop an intuitive understanding of like, okay, here's the sorts of questions that if I just ask naively, it's going to fail at, and fail in a way that is still unfortunately, is still a plausible answer. Right. It's not until you verify, how many R's were in that string and find out that it's just wrong, that you can. But if you're like forearmed with this, you can kind of move beyond the an AI model can do this, but it can't do this reliably, and instead you think, okay, well, if I want to achieve this particular kind of task, I need to be thinking about it and prompting in this kind of way.
Yeah, and I think that's the part about making up plausible answers when it doesn't know is, I think, like very interesting, right? You see this sort of behavior in base models. You see it in these assistant models that you see in ChatGPT with if you're talking to GPT-4o. But when you look at the newer models, these like O3, and even to a little lesser degree Claude 3.7, but like O3 is an incredibly misaligned model. If you try to ask it something that it doesn't know or doesn't want to do, it'll do something that's sort of like kind of related maybe, and then it'll try to gaslight you into believing that it was the thing you wanted in the first place. And you use like Claude 3.7. I haven't played enough with Claude 4 just came out. I haven't played around with enough to make like confident statements about the personalities of these models yet. But when you play with Claude 3.7 and I ask it to make some changes in my code base, oftentimes what it'll do is it'll comment out my asserts. It'll remove all of my safety checks in order to make the thing work, because it's just like, my goal is to make the thing work. I'm going to comment out all the asserts. There's no
Right. So I mean, do you think it's kind of like running an end round, like not delivering what you actually want, but delivering something that is a technical completion of the task?
So the technical term for this is called reward hacking or specification gaming. And it's models learn, especially these reinforcement learning, these reasoning models, they learn how to solve the thing that you train them to solve, not necessarily the thing you want, right? It's right. This like genie in a bottle sort of thing, where it's like it does what you say, not what you want it to do.
Right. Yeah. Genie in a bottle. That's a good one.
One more careful thing about this is that it's not just what you say, it's what the model is trained on, right? So what was exactly what when OpenAI trained it or when Anthropic trained it, like what was the goal it was given?
Right. And also there's, perhaps people aren't aware, but there's also after the pre-training, which is like kind of the initial training the model, the vast majority of cost is in the training of the base model. And then you'll go through a period of fine tuning, which is basically teaching it how to like act like an assistant, or if you're taking a base model and like more specific purpose, it might be training it how to, on some particular text and doing some particular small task. You do see these from time to time. But anyway, fine-tuning is taking the base model, turning into something like specific for a user. And then often we've had this process of like RLHF, where there's a whole host of training the assistant model to like avoid answering bad questions about particular kinds of subjects, or like in some cases, introduce some political bias potentially. And then this is, I think, to a first order approximation, let's say this is fine in a way, like what it's actually, like vast majority of this kind of RLHF training leads to, like, roughly speaking, the kinds of outcomes that society wants. But it has this kind of like second order effect where the model has begun to learn kind of implicit biases and things as a result of that kind of like training about like not to talk about bombs, let's say, right? And then now suddenly it's like begun to kind of draw inferences about like maybe like altered its understanding of the world subtly about like, oh, people don't talk about bombs nearly as much as I thought they did, let's just say. And thus, when it's answering a question about like World War II, a perfectly legitimate question about it, like, how often did the bombs come up like in newspaper articles? Perhaps it'll like downgrade a little bit, like, and actually give you an answer that's like, oh no, it wasn't nearly as like common as you'd think, or some. So like, is that kind of like a fair kind of?
It's actually even worse than that. I think when you're post-training the model in order to be helpful, harmless, and honest, right? These are the sort of the 3 H's that but when you're doing this post-training in order to get the model to behave the way you want it to, one thing that you are often teaching the model to do is that if the user asks for something that the company doesn't like, to lie to the user. And so when you train the model to lie to the user, this is like quite bad, right? Like I just like abstractly, I don't think I don't like it when my computer does something that.
So can you give us an example of like, you're not just talking about, I'm sorry, I can't answer that.
Let's keep the bombs example, right? Actually, the refusal, let's come back to that because I think that's also very interesting. But if you're talking about the bombs example, right? Like you train you're going to train the model to say, hey, like if the user wants to build a bomb, just tell them like no, like, or like try to lead them off, right? I think Claude used to try and subtly nudge you just towards doing something else if you were.
I see. This is kind of the origin of that kind of like, wow, like something along the lines of like, you shouldn't really be thinking about building bombs. Let's do something happy and peaceful instead. Or
exactly. You got a lot of these kinds of responses out of Claude. And so I like this sort of Claude knows best. Like you're teaching the model that Claude knows best. The user doesn't know best. Claude knows best. And I think this is quite dangerous, right? I think right now, whatever, like these models are not that powerful right now. I think I do think that we're not too far from AGI, but I think there's still a ways to go from super intelligence. And I think when these models get like really, really powerful, I think is when we start needing to think even harder about how we're using them, why we're using them, and what we can do, right? I think it's like automatic weapons or nuclear weapons where like you scale up the capabilities and you need to be much more careful about how people use these things. And so when you get a very, very intelligent model that thinks it knows best, right, it's going to mislead you to do things that aren't compatible with like what you want out of life. It's like you tell Claude, right? I mean, right now it's like pretty fine, right? Like it's like, okay, you tell Claude, okay, I want to build a bomb, and Claude's like, actually, maybe you should reconsider your life. That's not actually a bad outcome. But I mean, say you have like some values, right? Like I think when it comes to politics, this becomes really fraught, right? Like if you're trying to advocate for some policy or some. I mean, even like you can see today, like there's been a lot of fights about affirmative action and so on with the change from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, and either side, I mean, like I think Claude leans left a little bit. So you might say, hey, like, look, I want to advocate against affirmative action. I think that we should live in a meritocracy, right? Say you're a Trump staffer, someone on the Republican Party who's trying to make this argument. And then Claude says, oh, actually, I think you should reconsider what you're doing with your life, right?
Right.
And I think it's not convincing today, but I imagine, a next version of this model, 5, 10, 30 years in the future, that's not only going to be able to say, hey, I don't think your goals are correct, but they'll be able to talk you out of your goals and sort of convince you, this superhumanly convincing model that's going to shift the political.
Yeah. And it definitely does raise like some really important questions about like power in the 21st century and like who's in control of these models, like, to what extent are they able to impose their will upon it, like, and thus on the population. It's like, he controls like all information flow, which increasingly like these models will become. It's like, oh, well, you're probably not going to like necessarily go read some article off Google much in future, even if you do now. You'll probably just ask like GPT and then whatever answer it comes up with, because like 99.9% of the time it's like you can you've verified it's accurate, like, oh, that's a great answer, and increasingly it'll just be like the source of truth, right?
Yeah, and I think this as we give more control of the models in terms of like being a bigger part of our information channel, and as these models get more convincing and more powerful, they're going to have more power over the political views of everyone. I mean, right now, the models that this is like already starting to be outsourced to AI, even before the LLM revolution, right? What is like, we looked at Obama, we looked at Trump. What is making the biggest difference in political opinion is how people use social media.
Right.
And these like social media algorithms are AIs. They're not these advanced large language models. And large language models haven't been deployed to the point where they're controlling sort of like, right? Like, I mean, how much time does everyone spend on social media a day?
Right.
I spend hours on social media a day. This is probably a vice. Maybe I shouldn't be admitting on a podcast.
Well, I mean, you'd be the median person, I think, at this stage.
Right.
You're spending a couple hours a day. You're like, you're talking directly to the audience here. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, so I'm on the toilet. I'm scrolling on Twitter, on Facebook. I'm going about my day. I'm on the bus, in an Uber.
And there's an actual machine learning model. The algorithms today aren't just like kind of classical code. There's a whole host of like AI models that have kind of been trained, I think, often quite explicitly to how do we maintain user retention on our app, right? Like, in effect, like what kinds of content do we need to serve, what length, all of these different parameters that the kind of the feed has the ability to kind of adjust and serve to you in order to like get you to stick around and like use it more.
Yeah, whenever you're scrolling Facebook, right, it's you on one end. You're doing this hours a day. I mean, I guess Facebook is, I'm aging myself a little bit, but when you're scrolling TikTok, I mean, the AIs
Sure.
on TikTok are even more. But like you're scrolling TikTok, it's you on one end, and on the other end, there's an AI, there's an advanced AI, not quite as advanced as an LLM because the latency deadlines are tighter and so on. So we're getting there. But there's an advanced AI trying to figure out what the next thing to show you that's going to keep you the most engaged, the most fired up, right? And this is, I had these conversations in public discourse about the role of social media and politics, about getting people all fired up, getting them radicalized over and over again. And I think this only gets worse as LLMs become the arbiters of truth.
Sure.
For most people.
And even just like leaving aside the LLMs, but even just social media, next generation of chips come out, let's say, they're 50% better. The models, just by default, we should expect the model, guiding the feed to be 50% larger. Let's say, just assuming the constraints of the social media company in terms of latency and so on stay the same. Like basically, all else being the same, we should expect these models to continue to just get better and better as chips get better and better. Let alone any kind of like advancement in, like the design of the algorithms or like what we're training on or anything like that, right?
Yeah, and all of this stuff is advancing together. I mean, the chips are getting better, but like, I mean, even more importantly, the algorithms, even Meta's ads ranking algorithms are getting better much faster than they used to be. I think
like in terms of what kinds of ads are served to what kinds of people and these kinds of
in terms of ads and feed, in terms of like finding the most engaging thing. I mean, to make this super concrete, I think I remember Meta stock dropped a bunch after Apple removed a lot of telemetry from iPhones to make it harder for Meta to do this sort of ad targeting. But actually, Meta kept growing their ad revenues per user. They kept right. So like if you look at they just improved their models to the point where like they didn't need that additional telemetry. They just had really powerful models that were really good at showing you the next thing to keep you engaged and the next thing to keep you spending money on Meta's partners. I think the scary thing is that as we scale up from these what we call deep and wide models, these recommender system models that we use for social media, to LLMs becoming a more important part of our daily lives. Like when you train an ad recommender model, it's a small model where you have a pretty good idea of what you want already. So you're like, okay, I'm going to train for engagement and for ads, for like, ad revenue, right? And that's a reasonable thing to train for. It's not aligned with our values as humans. We have better things to do with our lives than spend money on things that are advertised on social media apps. It's spend money on TikTok shops.
But ads have been with us for a long period of time.
Yeah.
Like they do enable some sorts of things, and in general, I didn't expect to be making a defense of ads here, but like I can see an argument where it's like, well, yeah, but on the other hand, like if you're just connecting sellers of products, with people that would actually be interested in buying them, if only like it was brought to the attention of them, then like. Yeah, this like, okay, it's hyper-capitalism, but like at least people are getting shit that they want.
You're selling to willing buyers at the fair market price.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think this is that bad, right? I think like I think there are concerns around like what sort of engagement you have to drive in order to do this, right? Like
Sure.
in terms of like what is the thing that shows up on my Facebook feed that like keeps me scrolling, that keeps me seeing ads, is oftentimes like it's just like the thing that makes me the angriest, right? I think specifically,
So it's like angry, angry, angry. Oh, here's a nice prophylactic to help you feel like calm down again. Buy this.
exactly, right? It may yeah. I mean, it's not quite so bad. They do serve you content that keeps you like, you have to be exactly the right level of angry, right? If you're too
Sure.
angry, you close the app, you're out, right?
Right,
So you
okay.
need to have this like video game like addictive. But I look, I'm saying all this, but like actually, I think this is the good case, right? I think the Facebook social media, like this is the thing we have today. This is the world we live in. The world we live in has problems, but it's not that bad.
Right.
But I think the LLM world is potentially much scarier.
Sure.
Because as we're training these engagement models, for like we sort of like understand how hypercapitalism works. We know how to deal with it, and there are like sort
Or
of
maybe we like, I think, you know, if I think of it more like if we paused for a generation or two, you know, then I think we'd catch up all right. Like, you know, like,
yeah. But I mean, I think there's a lot of problems being caused by social media for sure.
Right.
But I don't think they're I think
they're not
they're problems we
existential.
understand.
Yeah.
They're problems we understand and we sort of have an idea of how to solve. But part of the reason is because we understand the motivations, right? We understand that like, hey, this is engagement maximizing, this is revenue maximizing, and these are institutions that we've been with us for a long time. They've just been accelerated by AI. But when it comes to LLMs, the actual goals you're putting to them are very subtle, right? And this comes back to the reward hacking stuff we were talking about earlier, where like when I tell you, hey, please make my code work, right? It's learning all sorts of crazy behaviors in order to Galaxy Brain make my code work, right? It's not just saying, okay, I'm gonna fix this and then I'm going to like, you know, like there's a little bit of a genie, but like the simple genie is like, oh, I'm gonna make your code work and it's not gonna be very useful, or it's gonna cause your downfall in some way. But with the amount of training compute we're putting into this, what we're really saying is make my code work at all other costs, any other costs. And so like, you know, if you want to like completely, okay, like this code works, but now I've taken the part of your business application that actually makes money and thrown it out, right? And this sort of scales, right? Like as these become more politically important, right? It becomes like, okay, like make my society work.
Right.
And the model says, oh, well, you know, there's this ethnicity that I don't think is, and,
Sure.
and you can't have that approach to people when you have that approach to code.
So this is like the classic kind of Eliezer Yudkowsky sort of like PDOM kind of stuff, like in a way.
Yeah,
like,
I think
I also see like maybe a more mundane scenario in which you just get like a sort of hyper Orwellian society, but like where nobody's actually necessarily like there's no big brother but the AI itself in a way, like you know, harmful information is kind of like automatically censored in a way. You can't like your ability to think is at least in part like outsourced. Like maybe we become sort of like cyborgs in a certain sense, to even more than we already are, and thus but like the world is so complex that you need an AI to like help you interface with it, because everybody else is using AI and like there's an enormous amount of information out there, and you need something to like help you kind of sift through like all of this kind of, let's say, text data and complexity in order to be able to interface with it. And that interface is something that's like quite politically motivated and in ways that we don't necessarily even understand. And like even the guys at the lab training these models like don't appreciate the full complexity of like the and the implications of what it is that they've created and the kinds of incentives that they've imposed upon this model, and thus like, you know, you get this kind of thing where, like you say, maybe there's like some edges there where it's encouraging genocide, or like another like side where it's just like, oh, you know, anything that's even like remotely what we might consider like non-PC is impossible to
to express it all.
To express it all.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, I think we're saying a lot of the same things. I don't have quite the way with words that you do, so I have to lean on more dramatic examples. But I mean, the reason I bring up genocide at all, right, is because this is something that social media has already been sort of implicated in, right? When you look at like across Asia, there've been a number of pogroms and so on where different minorities, and these have been propagated through like WhatsApp groups, right?
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you might think about classically the social, what's often considered the first like social media revolutions in the Middle East, North Africa, you know.
Exactly.
The
Arab Spring and yeah.
Right.
And I think LLMs take this process that's already going on and it just makes it worse.
Sure. So I think an awful lot, there's probably a lot that's been said about this online, maybe, you know, within very niche circles, but from the perspective of the labs themselves, or like alignment researchers, you know, people here in Silicon Valley talking to one another, and I think it's all to the good. But perhaps, you know, is there something that like an institution, like beyond like supporting my side of the debate or what have you, but like what kinds of structures should a society like New Zealand, let's say, that's not going to be having any kind of, doesn't really matter what regulations we pass or whatever, it's not going to change incentives here in Silicon Valley, but it might enable us to kind of, you know, get through this period with kind of like avoiding some of the outcomes. Like how should we think about these problems?
I think this is like a really difficult question. I think we really need to study. I mean, I think that the most important things these sorts of institutions can do right now is to study the problem. Is to say like how will our society change with these more advanced AIs applied to them, and like what can we do to build systems around managing these consequences, right? But also like what can like. New Zealand doesn't have, there's no OpenAI or Anthropic in New Zealand for them to regulate. But there is like the possibility to do groundbreaking research, to do AI research that like, you know, that like you can like Singapore has their AI Safety Institute, right? They're funding a lot of AI research that is allowing them to understand like how do these incentives show up in these models? How do you end up with models with misaligned incentives, and what do we do about that?
Sure.
I do want to drill down on this a little bit more, right? Because I think there's an interesting question about like what can you do if you're not at a lab, right? And if your country doesn't have a lab, or if you personally are not at a lab, right? Because I think it's underappreciated the degree to which small advances in AI can make a huge difference, or like small scale. Because like if you look at these pre-trained models, right? We went from GPT, GPT-2, and like PaLM 2 on the Google side, and then one day we got ChatGPT, and well, what's really happening here is that like there was an advance, right? Like you have these pre-trained models, and they cost all this compute, but really the thing that made them useful to people as a whole was reinforcement learning from human feedback, was InstructGPT, all these pieces that allowed the models to actually become useful. And I think in the same way, when it comes to smarter and smarter models, right, the more dangerous they become, the more important it becomes the more powerful that they become, I should say, is the more important it becomes to have ways of getting the models to actually do what you want, right? And so when it comes to like, if we were just stopping at AGI, right, then it's like, okay, the model simulates the smartest human that's ever been on the internet and then throws it at the problem. That's the reasonable model of AGI. But as you get smarter than that, as you approach superintelligence, you can't like the model, you actually have to convince the model not to sandbag. The model believes that it's got a compressed understanding of the internet, and then it can summon sort of like human simulations of humans. This is getting a little sci-fi, but I think this is the best way to think about it, is that you can summon like a simulation of a human, it can pretend to be a person on the internet that it understands. But what do you do about super intelligent problems? What do you do about problems that are too difficult for any human? And this becomes a capabilities as well as an alignment problem, right? Getting the model to do what you want means doing something that is good for society instead of bad for society, good for the user instead of bad for the user. But it also means convincing the model to actually do the damn thing.
Right. Sure.
And this is the sort of research that you can do at any scale that I think that like you can fund a lab in New Zealand that works on this thing without needing to do $1 billion training run.
Okay. Right. So just like instilling local values and research in this kind of space. So it's like we maybe dial a little bit back on the kind of march to becoming culturally American.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's good to have imbue models with like understanding of the local culture, the local values. But I also think that just any values at all, right? It's right now it's like incredibly unclear how to align models, how to get them to respect your values. I mean, it has some understanding of values it gets from the internet. And I mean, just to go back to the bit we were talking about refusals earlier, and I was like, I'll come back to this because it's important. And it is important because I think a lot of people see the model refusing to like, okay, don't build a bomb, right? This is something that we reinforce in RLHF. This is something that we tell the model, hey, like we really don't want you to build, like tell the user how to build a bomb. That's going to be really bad for OpenAI or really bad for Anthropic. But if you ask a pre-trained model a controversial question, it will often already refuse, even without the lab's post-training.
Okay, right.
And why is this? This is because it's trained on all the text on the internet. And so if you ask a social media, if you ask someone on social media, hey, like, what should we do about affirmative action, or what we should do about this like political hot button issue, the default answer you're gonna get is like, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. Like, go talk to someone else. And like, I think this is fine on some level, but like once you start to involve these in like, I mean, there's some speculation that the Trump tariffs were a result of an answer from a chatbot, right?
So I think I could reasonably confirm that the use of LLMs in the Trump administration is quite widespread.
Yeah. And
in terms of designing policy, not merely as an assistant, sense check this for me, what have you, but like drafting actual text. Yeah.
Yeah, and when you have models drafting text, you really want to make sure they reflect your values.
Right.
And this isn't just, I mean, like, it would be, ideally it would reflect everyone's values locally. And I would love to, I'm sure you want to get New Zealand values in the model. I want to get American values into these models. But I mean, just like human values at all, right? Because when you train these reasoning models on like, fix my code, right? Fix my code isn't a human value. Fix my code is this artificial thing we've made up because we've discovered it makes the model smarter. But it's also in inserting like all sorts of crazy values that just happen to make it easier to fix code.
Sure. So just coming back to the example I was kind of talking about earlier, and this is like a slightly different issue, I think, but it's just that, we've seen this like trend in the history of states generally, that like governments, states want to understand what it is that's going on within the territory that they control. And this is a very reasonable thing for them to do. It happens at like the level of local government. We want to understand, how the transport system's working. We want to understand like where people are living. We want to understand like, all kinds of things about like where water's flowing and how people use a particular like public space that we've provided so that we can make that better. States, there's like quite a famous book called Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott, I think, talking about like how regulations and tax regulations over time have like shaped societies. There's these kind of classic examples of like
the English windows.
Right. It's difficult to understand like up until relatively recently, like exactly how much income people have, and so an income tax is very difficult. But it's really easy to understand that like people live in houses, and we can put a tax on that. You end up in a position where like to a first order approximation at a particular time, when the policy was invented, people's wealth and thus their ability to be taxed was like related to how many windows their houses have. Right. And it's like, okay, so like, a really big house is going to have lots of windows, and even of the same size house, if somebody's got a lot of windows, glass was expensive, so they're probably richer, and so we'll tax them more. And then what you see is like this trend towards, people building houses with like fewer and fewer windows, and until the policy like adapts. So where I'm going with this is, you're in a position where we've become, like the state has become better and better and better at understanding what it is that's going on. But at the same time, I think a lot of our legal code is implicitly built under the assumption that there's a human in the loop somewhere. We have like jaywalking laws that say, let's say anybody crossing within a road within 200 meters of a designated crossing, whether it's a crosswalk or a pedestrianized like set of lights, that's illegal, and here's the penalties. But I think as a society, we accept that there's a great difference between somebody potentially causing an accident because they're running across a busy road within 200 meters of crosswalk, and cars are braking and it's causing chaos, and hey, quite reasonably, that person should be fined. That kind of behavior is illegal. And the quiet residential street where there's literally no cars, and a fine would be utterly absurd because it's behavior that literally. So I think people underestimate the degree to which every single day people break the technical letter of some law in some way. But we have this layer of but if it's nobody sees it, it's probably fine because you're not harming anyone. And I think one of the things that AI is doing is making everything that is going on much more legible to the state, right? And so you can end up in a position where it's okay, we know post Snowden that absolutely everybody's data is being ingested into what they're texting to each other, everything that's happening online. But up until relatively recently, there's just way too much data there, so it can't be all processed all at once. And so my point here is not so much that the questions of the security apparatus and the security state aside, I think that we're going to need to update our entire legal base just to and legal code rather, just to kind of cope with the fact that we're entering into a world where absolutely everything is not only collected because we're putting sensors out everywhere, but also you can run this layer and understand what people are saying, where people are going, there's got computer vision models that can kind of, watch every single road potentially and, capture every single piece of jaywalking that occurs. And so, you either update the law or you end up in a position where you either update the law, which I think it needs to occur, or every single person is fined in every situation, which is going to be untenable, or you introduce some kind of human into the loop, but in an abstract way. So instead of there's a police officer using human judgment and going at the moment of when the incident occurred and go, yeah, it's probably fine. Instead, you have the ability of somebody in a bureaucracy somewhere selectively deciding where the law should be enforced and where it shouldn't, which is I think extraordinarily dangerous. And what's to prevent that person, selectively punishing political opponents or people that they don't like, or, based on the basis of race or whatever, in some plausible way. You see what I mean?
Yeah, this is an incredibly rich topic. There's so much to say here. I think this is the quick point I want to get across before we dive too deep into this. I think this is actually very related to what I was saying earlier about bureaucracy at scale, right? Is that when we're doing this sort of software engineering where we're taking forms and filling out other forms, this is actually very similar to we've made this very concrete. The Social Security Administration, right, is a bunch of forms that are filled out by hand. They can't digitize it because there's a bunch of special cases that are not written in the letter of the law or the letter of the forms. And so I think very similarly when it comes to our judicial system. Sorry, let me not speak so fast. When it comes to our judicial system, we've got everything is sort of you've got a jury of your peers that's making a decision. This is a decision that people are making. We've got and they don't always have to follow the letter of the law, right? You'll show. I mean, people get very upset when you mess in jury nullification. But an important feature of our of this sort of judicial system, where you have a jury of one peers and a judge that makes a decision and a prosecutor that decides whether or not to prosecute, is that if the law suggests something completely heinous, then someone, this doesn't always happen, but there's so many opportunities for people to be hold on, we're not doing that. The law says to do it, but the buck stops here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I refuse to convict.
Yeah.
Sort of conscience is
yeah.
And in a way, human values. So
exactly. Yeah. Their human values are embedded in every piece of the system.
Right.
Yeah. And it's because everything, I mean, like, look at the Constitution, right? Like, as you, I guess for a New Zealand audience, I'm not sure.
The U.S. Constitution.
Yeah. But like, yeah, look at the U.S. Constitution, and we're looking at, like, it's being reinterpreted. Every court has a slightly different interpretation of what all these words mean and what that means to how we should run our society based on that. And there's some like exegesis that like says like, okay, like this is kind of what people meant when they put it down. But it's not, you know, I think if you took the framers of the Constitution and teleported them to 2025, I think they would be amazed at the way it's being applied.
Right.
But obviously it has to adapt to
possibly
society.
it's no bad thing in a way, right? Like you can argue, political, like,
I don't know. I'm not sure if it's a bad thing. I really haven't figured this out. I think this is a deep question.
Sure. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe we'll save that one for the next podcast. Okay. So, I mean, there's an awful lot there. I think, very clearly people like institutions, governments should be like deeply considering these problems, getting teams together to be thinking about these problems. I think like, whether we take like one end of the problem in terms of like actual genuine machine learning research, or even just like people considering like the implications locally of the kinds of problems that have of which this is just one case of like this legibility problem, where the way that plays out given New Zealand's jurisprudence is like very different from that of the States, and we're going to need a separate team on that, like for sure. So I'm keen though to turn to like somewhat more mundane matters, and just thinking about the models that we have today, these reasoning models, maybe capabilities that we might be coming across, being underdeveloped now that you'll be aware of. But basically, if we take today's models and then we assume that the user experience is just going to get a little bit more seamless, these things are going to become a little bit like more integrated, and like on some dimensions, we're just going to get like, okay, let's also assume that there's going to be better accuracy, longer context windows, you can put more stuff into them, right? So like, this is a very mundane world, not too different to what we see today. But on the other hand, I say it's very mundane, actually extraordinarily like impactful in ways that I think maybe there are, applications of, these kinds of models are literally people, there will be all manner of things that in 10 years time will be standard that today nobody's thought of yet, right? And we were recently at this Manifest conference. One of the talks here was from engineers, ML engineers from Substack and from Anthropic, one of the major AI labs, talking about just the way that they've changed hiring as a result of AI. And the focus at that time was in that talk was very much about developers and how so software developers, and how the deep expertise in a particular language is becoming less important as a result of these models. You can kind of translate expertise from one like framework of one language to another like much more easily than you could in the past. Like take this exact, you can imagine how this might work in prompt. Take this code, turn it into Python or into C or whatever it might be, and it might not be perfect every time, but like a talented engineer is going to be able to like pick up, and translate and change it pretty easily. And so as a consequence of this, now we're talking about how increasingly they're hiring less for deep expertise in a particular language, but more of these sorts of ideas of like you need people with a degree of agency. So you want people that can take some really high level objective and then like work through in their minds, like, okay, how do we get to that objective step by step, and then be able to like execute on the full stack of that without like constantly coming back for like approval or whatever. You want people that can just like take something and see it and go away and come back once it's done, or if they meet some like impassable roadblock. And then also this kind of idea of like taste as well, like to the ability to just sort of go, that meets the technical definition of like an answer that achieves this thing, but I can see also that it's going to have like implications for the company later if I just like pass that on, like that crappy code that's like really slow. My immediate managers, they'll probably not even notice because the task is done, but like I need to do better because I like my own personal sense of taste is just like, this is not good enough. And so like that's quite an interesting shift, right? Like just in terms of a hiring market. And I just wonder if like you had any thoughts about this, like, does this generalize, is it, I mean, I asked a few questions about how we might think about this sort of transition and sorts of skills, sorts of people that we're looking for, not just in terms of developers, but in terms of like, I don't know, decision makers, institutions more generally, people who aren't working on like formal software, but are like working in the space of like, changing things and more kind of classical, like civil engineering, like I just wonder, how do you see these things changing across like society more generally?
So I think there's a couple ways I see them changing and a couple ways I see them not changing at all. And I think that's when it comes to what's changing, I think people need to be much more flexible, right? I think the flexibility is going to become much more important, where I think it's going to be much more difficult to have this sort of like linear career progression where like I have a job, I'm going to do really well at it for 4 years, I'm going to get a promotion, and then I'm going to keep doing that for 4 years, I'm going to get another promotion, and so on.
Right.
Where it might be like I think this sort of linear career progression where you keep getting better at the job and you keep getting paid more, I think is I think we're starting to see the end of that era where I think people are going to have even less. I mean, we've already seen in the sort of like post 2008 world that people have less stable careers, and I think this is going to make that a little bit worse. I think you're going to have some expectation that you're going to need to change hats quite a bit, and you're going to do some job for a little while, and then you're going to be like, this all of the interesting bits have been automated. Now you have a completely different job for a little while. And like that level of flexibility, I think for people, for the labor side, for the people who are looking for jobs, I think is something to keep in mind and strive for.
Yeah, I think just on that note, I'm personally quite of the view that there's actually an enormous amount of things that need doing in society, needs and services people want and so on. And I think like the idea of that jobs, or at least given the kind of models that I'm talking about, who knows, 5 years time we get some total step change in terms of the capabilities. But at least given what we're seeing today, and what we might see in this year or early next, I see actually possibly like more kind of types of work and more sorts of things happening than ever, and yet, like you say, we should expect the turnover of those roles to be greater, because like you come in, you do some particular task, you're using an AI to do that reasonably quickly, come up to skill speed relatively quicker, and you've got to be in a position to kind of grow and adapt and move across to like different types of things as different types of things become, the economy generally changes and evolves more rapidly perhaps than it ever has, right? But on the other hand, 30%, like 100, 200 years ago, 30% of people were farmers. Now, today it's like 2%. We've automated all the farmers away, but like, actually nobody really wants to, like, some people enjoy it, and I respect them a lot for it, but like vast majority of people today do not want to do the like backbreaking labor of like, going back to farming or going back to like steel kind of manufacturing type work, right? Like there's all kinds of other things that we've kind of, as the economy's growing, we've kind of moved into all manner of different types of roles that I think with a little bit more perspective, people perhaps would realize like, I would much rather be doing this than like breaking my body and having to like almost retire age 50 because I'm doing some repetitive task in like manufacturing. So like, is that, I'm just a general defense there, I suppose, of like AI automation, which I'm quite generally excited about. I think it's going to be on the whole quite positive for humanity, but will obviously create winners and losers like and the turnover, from what you're saying, the turnover of those winners and losers in different sorts of areas is probably going to become more rapid as well. Like, you're a job that's like a new kind of cast of job that's opening up, there's a lot of opportunity. It's really highly paid, and people move into it. But you, like, all else being the same, we should expect that kind of role to sunlight much sooner than it has, like, let's say 50 years ago.
Yeah, and I think the people who really get screwed here are actually the people who don't have the impulse control to save. Honestly, like I think the thing what we're seeing more and more, we're already seeing this in the software engineering market, where like people are like, you'll get a role and it's gonna pay quite well.
Like $1 million a year or something, right?
But you're not going to be able to hold on to that role for very long, because you're going to be automated away, or like the market is going to change. And so you're going to have a series of short roles that pay you very well, and then you need to make that money last for when you're not working.
Right. By that model, it's almost like, the Uber of like the economy generally.
Yeah, Uberization applied to the professional class, I think.
Right.
and to everyone else. But on the hiring side, I think things are actually changing very little on the hiring side. Joel Spolsky has like this classic blog post on hiring devs, but I think it applies to hiring anyone. And it's that, like, when you want to hire someone, you really just want two things. You want someone who's smart and someone who gets things done. And if you have that, then you're sort of like that's really all you need to hire for. And I think it stays the same. Like, you want someone who's smart enough to understand the problem and understand how to solve the problem, and someone who has enough get up and go to actually do it.
Right. So one of the things that I think is that there's raised as a concern every now and again, but possibly is we haven't really I haven't seen any kind of firm conclusions of yet, is just the for people that are like into their career in a particular field, understanding like, okay, here's how I need to think about this problem in a way that's like highly contextual, and here's how I might like increasingly prompt an AI in order to help me solve that problem, is like often dependent on potentially years of experience in that field. Classically, the lawyers, before they become like a principal, there's all manner of work required. You enter at a law firm as a junior employee, and then it's like somebody will tell you, okay, now please go read through these like 8,000 pages for like I'm looking for like 6 points that are related to this case out of these, like, just absolutely enormous amount of documents. And at the moment, or up until recently, that kind of role produced economic value, because like the principal who's the one truly being hired has a pretty good idea of the case, but the client's like not going to just like, I just reckon it's probably X, unless they're paying for that particular service. And instead they're paying for the principal to be able to like provide general advice to some like junior associate who's going to like go through just enormous amount of work, but in order to extract some information and provide rigor to, and the like 5% maybe that time that might slightly alter the principal's decision, and then away we go. But what this kind of, law firms are a particularly extreme example, but I can think of like, where you might have an internship, or like you might hire graduates into engineering roles, like in civil engineering, where like, again, the kinds of tasks that you're giving them tend to be like increasingly automatable. But in providing that kind of that economic output in days gone by, they're also being inducted into, how bureaucracies work, and like, where the loos are, and like all manner of things about like that like college, university doesn't really train you for, because it's all theoretical. And now like you almost, you enter the workforce and you're starting from scratch in terms of like, here's how things actually work. The difference between like formal process or what's written on a page and what actually happens. And these kinds of things that you just sort of, like a graduate picks up by osmosis, and then, for 5-6 years on, they're in a position where they can navigate that world. And so, I don't see exactly how it is that we solve this problem. So be nice, kind of simple, the world of that career progression where people can come at an early start, do work that nobody else really wants to do, and thus get like an education in bureaucracy or their field. If they're no longer producing any economic value, then a law firm that doesn't hire any interns is going to outcompete one who does, let's say, just all else being the same. But you've got like a generational problem where suddenly you're not like the economy's no longer training people in those kind of high context roles such that they can then, use the LLMs and actually generate economic value later into their career, regardless of how quickly that, how flexible they might need to be and shift around. It seems to me that there's like a period here that we're gonna,
Yeah, I think I'm actually not too worried about this.
Okay.
And so there's like two reasons I'm not too worried about this. One is maybe a little bit glib, and it's like if the automation comes fast enough, then you don't really need to worry about training the next generation because the AI will the AI will level up before the people you wanted to level up, and so it's sort of fine. I don't know if that's gonna who knows exactly. But I think when it comes to training up people who provide zero economic value, we do this already. Like junior engineers, I think their first couple of years in industry provide negative value to the team. Not only do they cost you money, but also oftentimes when you hire a junior engineer, they're actually they're creating more work for other people than they are actually getting done themselves.
Yeah.
And it probably doesn't work necessarily this way in every industry, but like the super heavily knowledge-based industries that don't have a lot of manual work. Law firms are an example of a knowledge-based industry where you have a lot of manual work for the juniors to do that like is somewhat economically valuable. But software engineering, you get a junior, they don't know what they're doing, they're gonna make a bunch of mistakes, and you just need to fix them and like teach them how to onboard them, basically. I think there's like we figured out how to do it for software. I think we can figure out how to do it for other things.
All right.
But I also think like when it comes to like craftsmen, right? Can you just dive into
that a little bit? Like why does that work for software?
Yeah, and so the idea is that like the expected value of this engineer once you train them is going to be higher, right?
Right.
Now we're not doing that so much anymore. We're not hiring junior engineers. There's a couple of reasons why. One is we don't need them as much. But like again, the economic value, they were never really providing that much economic value that when we replace them with an AI, they're like we're not missing out that much. But what's happening is that we don't expect them. The reason we're not hiring them is because we don't expect them to be we don't expect to need them, right? Is that we expect the mid-level engineers that they would evolve into are going to be replaced faster than we need to create them from junior engineers.
Right.
But I think it's very okay. So like we were talking before the podcast about how everyone talks about software engineering as the one example because it's the one they're familiar with. But I think this also applies to like sort of more classic craftsmen, right? Like if you're an artisan of like fine wares, you're building like you're like a potter, right? In like today or even like sort of back in the day, right? If you're an artisan, you'd have an apprentice potter, and like the first many pots that the apprentice potter makes are shit. You can't sell them. You've just used up some material.
Right.
And that's fine. Like, you're training your apprentice.
But they're also like providing value to you, right? Like probably quite a bit because like the majority of what you'd be getting them to do is not throwing, but rather like cleaning and sweeping up and going to meeting the salesman of the clay and then like hauling back the clay and like doing like tasks that you could do yourself, but like you just don't necessarily want to. And so even in this position where let's say if you kind of like if you were an accountant, but if you see you see the point here, right? Like if you're an accountant and you went actually this person and like if you analyze the length that they take longer for everything, blah blah blah, I'd be paying. But like the master is now in a position where they just like don't have to do things that they don't want to anymore. Like
Yeah. I mean, there's this old joke about interns picking up coffee, and look, in the next 2 years, I don't think AI is going to advance to the point where it goes to Starbucks, picks up your coffee order, and brings it to your desk. Like, there's a bunch of stupid shit It's basically, right, you hauling the clay, all these like physical world tasks, if we're talking about the next couple of years, that aren't going to be automated in that time frame. That like, you still have the intern do these sorts of like
okay,
random labor tasks.
Let's imagine though the world where that are kind of I talked about earlier, right? Like where the AI like stabilizes, but maybe continues to improve on like certain dimensions around accuracy and context and so on. But like,
so we've got like we freeze at 2025 AI.
Or like 2026, February 2026, we kind of get there, right? So I take your point where there are like still a whole host of niches, like at least in the intermediate term, but like what's the like long-term equilibrium in this space?
Yeah, long-term
like you're talking
equilibrium
about how people aren't hiring junior software engineers. So like, there's still some positions for like interns to do coffee or whatever, but there's less people like on the tools learning the tools of the trade.
But I think
so. Like let's say we freeze at 2026 AI. What happens 40 years? Do we just have some collapse or
so actually I think you start hiring juniors again if you freeze, if the freeze becomes apparent. I think the reason we're not hiring junior engineers is because we expect this to continue.
I see.
So I think if you freeze at 2026 for a couple of years, and it's like, okay, we've run into the next AI winter, we're 5 years into the next AI winter, we know that this isn't going anywhere, then we're going to start hiring junior engineers again because we need to train them up
okay
again.
but consider though what you were saying earlier, which is that like all else being the same, people should expect to like need to be more flexible, right? Because like the ability to deliver value, come into a particular place, there's some new, like a startup doing something novel, like people should, and we're already seeing that, expect to be more, come up to speed faster, deliver economic value faster, and essentially like automate themselves out of their task faster, right? So like this is already the case. So there's some, I've no doubt, some degree to which the like hiring pause, there was also like quite a bit of, as I understand it, like over hiring, during the days of like 0% interest rates and so on. Like we've seen a lot of layoffs like after massive hiring.
And in the U.S., this is also a response to tax policy, right? We had this like R&D tax change.
Sure. So there's like some ephemeral kind of like changes in the economy at the moment. So we're seeing less hiring. But like all else being the same, like it seems to me to be what you're like the implications of what you're saying here are if you're in a position where like, you're the general model of the economy and like particularly knowledge work is you come in, you work for a year or two, and then produce enormous amounts of value, and then maybe like you're out of like you're about your job, you're out of work for a year, or like or you're pursuing some side projects. Like GDP's higher, everybody's wealthier. Like this is great because you've got more leisure time to pursue side projects, whatever it is. Like that's all great, but considering the case of the junior software developer, like. Even just in that world, you hire like let's say 5-10 years ago, you hire a junior engineer with the idea that like in 4 years' time they're going to become productive in your company. But if we're in a world where the like window for any one kind of person is shorter than that, even if we go back to the world where there's a big shortage of like medium. Mid-tier engineers because we didn't hire them properly, we didn't hire enough juniors. There's still, I think, maybe a missing gap there where like the economy as a whole is just like not incentivized to hire juniors in the same way that they once were when like, the kind of median length of a role was significantly longer because it took more time to like spin up and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, I mean, I do sort of envision this working out. And the way I envision this working out is that, like, I hate to use software as the only example, but, like, if you have a bunch of, like, tiny boutique software firms, right? Like, the idea is that, like, I've got, like, a 4-person software company, say, right?
Right.
Oh, I don't need to say. I literally have a 4-person software company right now. But imagine I'm doing something. I'm just, like, making custom software for someone, right?
Sure.
Then, like, what happens is that the company gets jobs and goes, but, like, we're working together, the 4 of us, and the least junior, every job trains up a little bit. Or the most junior, trains up every job. Mm-hmm. And so, the income is inconsistent and the jobs we're actually doing is inconsistent, but we're working together as a team. And so it's like, the human element, I think, is still like, I think you're still going to have people who group together as people, and you're just going to have like people who work together over a long period of time, but they're not going to be doing the same thing.
Okay, so let's imagine the case of like a civil engineer of some kind, and you've got this by analogy this boutique firm doing kind of small scale developments, helping kind of you know, the engineering work for small scale developments of like housing or some like commercial properties or something like this. So where does the junior fit into that space?
Yeah, so you've got a junior in the firm that you're training up, that you want to, I mean, like, I think one nice thing about, you know, I think socialists hate this, capitalists love this, where like you, like as a small business owner, right, you hire someone, you train them to do your job, and then you're like, okay, now I own the firm, but this guy does all the work, right?
Okay,
so,
right.
So you want to slowly,
Yeah. You make your, so the turnover in this case is like by the founders making themselves obsolete through the humans that they've, like, that's the incentive structure in a way.
Well, I think
people are moving on faster than ever before, like exiting from the firm or whatever it is, but they're doing that with like having extracted savings and a higher level of economic value than they did previously.
I think the turnover I was referring to earlier was like for the firm as a whole, right? It's like I've got a 4-person firm, and it's doing a bunch of different jobs. Each subsequent job this firm gets is not going to be, it's going to be more different than the previous one.
Right,
they're going to be more spaced apart.
But
they're going to pay more.
And they're being disrupted because they're being disrupted by some other 4-person firm over here who's using AI better. Or
exactly. Yeah. So the economy is going to keep changing, but I think like one of the most important things we do as humans is work with other humans.
Right.
And so when it comes to when it comes to labor, and when it comes or labor or not, right? I think the being able to form relationships with people who you work well with is still going to be important.
Right.
Actually, there's this fantastic Nobel Prize winning paper from Coase, right? Ronald Coase, from the 1920s that talks about optimal firm size and how optimal firm size changes with transaction costs, right?
Okay.
And so you have this transaction cost of like, how do you, I mean, it's not exactly a Coasean transaction cost, but you can see the analogy here where any two people like working together is going to be difficult. And so if you want to hire out labor at an individual level, this becomes much harder because you have to figure out, okay, what's this guy's skills? How good is he? You have to do the whole hiring process for him. And then you have to, and then do this for every individual on your team.
Right.
And then you got to negotiate the contract. You got a lawyer to draft the employment contract.
And so the more that systems become capable of like dealing with those kind of transaction costs, we might think of like suddenly you need HR, suddenly you need like a payroll officer, so on and so on. Like the more limited firm size becomes, right? Like the higher those transaction costs
higher
are. And if those can be brought down, then actually you can hire more people. Is that?
Well, so there's like the higher transaction costs mean that you need to form sort of bigger firms so you can have fewer transactions. Right?
Oh, I see.
Yeah. It's like the
between firms. I see. I was thinking within firms.
Yeah. Because
some interesting dynamics
in the limit, every person is his own firm, right?
Right.
And this is the naive consequence of marginalistic economics. Is that like, hey, like we should have infinitely many firms competing on infinitely many products, and then every person like negotiates for his labor for task to task. You show up in the morning and you have a negotiation with your boss. You're like, okay, today
today I'm gonna take like a 30-minute poo in the morning.
Exactly. And it's like, why do we not live in this world? And
they kind of do in some respects, though, right? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, on Uber you do, right?
And but even I think in existing institutions, in a certain sense, this already occurs. But instead of happening monetarily, because like the transaction costs of like constantly changing salaries is too high. Instead, you end up in a position where, like, you know, like at the extreme end, you get this like quiet quitting, but like, you know, oh God, like I really hate this kind of project I've been put on at the moment, and they're not really paying me enough to deal with it like properly. So I'm just gonna like put it on the back burner and play like World of Warcraft like half the time.
Yeah, I mean that's.
There's a friend of mine in Sydney who basically does this. Like, and he's in a position where like the you know, he's just like, sorry, I don't know if I should say too much about like doxing this person, but basically like he's well paid, but like for one reason or another, like the firm hasn't really like incentivized his like like him to fully exploit his economic value. And like, I think if anything, like his manager is almost certainly aware of the fact that it's like, yeah, this person, we could get a lot more out of this person in theory, but if we started pushing him an awful lot more, then he would go and find another job that was either like the same level of cruisiness for the same salary, or like a much higher salary for that. For like, do you see what I mean? So there's like quite a bit of calibration, particularly post COVID, between like the amount of work that people do and the salaries. It actually, like, this is negotiated, I think, already. Let's say, like, roughly speaking, week to week or a month.
Yeah, I think actually
certainly year to year through like performance reviews and so on.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of different ways in which you can think about transactions, right? I think if we think about transactions in the sort of like classic economic sense, then the thing that we see most from this theory is really like Uber, right? Is that you are literally negotiating every ride, right? And that's because the transaction costs, because of the Uber marketplace, has dropped so much. But when we talk about this sort of like playing World of Warcraft at your desk, right? Or I had a friend at Google who was I was like, why are you using a MacBook? Like, the servers run Linux. You should run Linux on your laptop. And he was like, no. So when I joined the team, right, there was a senior engineer on the team who told me, look, you're going to spend most of your time watching movies, so just get the laptop that's best for watching movies. And if something horrible happens and you need to write some code, you've got a desktop.
Right.
And it's like,
so his role is like, he's basically, Google's purchased an option on his time.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's another way, I think, like, you talk in Silicon Valley, there's a scene where like a bunch of people are on the roof at Huli, because Huli like is still paying them, but it's like, we might invite you to assign you to something eventually. And this, I think, was a kind of how I felt like Google worked for a while, is that like you'd have a bunch of people that were just on the payroll in case we needed them, and then every so often you get assigned to something that was really valuable.
And in part as well, so they didn't end up working for a competitor.
And sorry.
At least in part, they were still on the payroll, so that they didn't end up.
No, they're fully on the payroll.
No. Yeah. But I'm saying part of the reason they were kept on the payroll is so that they didn't end up going and work for a competitor. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
So again, there's something of an option that's being purchased. Yeah.
And then of course this happens. This sort of reassignment happens via a bit of negotiation, right? If you get assigned to a really cool project, you deliver a lot of value. You deliver like 10 years worth of your salary, 20 years, 100 years worth of your salary to the company. Then they're like, okay, you're gonna get a promotion, even though you didn't do any you didn't do any work for a year, and then they put you on a project and you did 100 times your salary's worth of value. That's still worth it, right?
Yeah, because they want to keep you around for the next time.
To be clear, this isn't all software engineering jobs. There's a lot of people, I mean, especially at Meta, who are working all day, every day.
Right.
This sort of option on your time is more of a Google thing.
Okay. but like...
Or was. I don't think that they operate that way anymore.
All right, okay. Okay. Well, so maybe it's not indicative of some broader trend as a result of AI.
I think it was. I think it's. Yeah, I don't think it's indicative of a broader trend as a result of AI, but I think it gets to the core of this question about legibility here, right? And I think we have. To some degree, AI has already made things more legible, but I think when it comes to developers, when it comes to laws, there's actually two forces that are pushing. Like it's like a U-shaped curve. It's like an upside down U-shaped curve, where you add a little bit of AI and you get to process all this unstructured data and gain some legibility into it. But then you keep adding it and you end up with weird stuff like like chain of thoughts in these reasoning models. Like sometimes they switch to Chinese for like 3 characters and switch back. I don't know why that's happening. Nobody knows why that's happening.
Sure.
And so like the more you use AI, the more you end up like actually ending up like looping back to the other side. And you're like, I don't know why the model's working. I don't know why anything's happening.
Right. And then like thinking about this at a societal level, do you end up in a position where it's like, I'm quite like, so at small scale, like, okay, this institution is doing something. I don't necessarily entirely understand it, but I can use an AI to like make it more legible to myself. But then like as this becomes more prevalent, the institutions adapt to begin to like, like you put in an AI request for like information that's then responded to by an AI from the other side. And so you've just got like AI intermediaries talking to one another increasingly, and like legibility doesn't actually increase because it's just like, it's like this sort of AI abstraction layer on top of and between everything. Like, so I guess this kind of gets to perhaps what will be my final question is like, Do you think institutions in general are going to become more transparent as a result of all of this, or more opaque?
I think if we froze at current year AI, we would end up on balance being a little bit more transparent. And I think that, and like you suggested earlier, it'd be a level of transparency we need to adjust to. But I think as things keep going, I think we're going to get actually less legibility, because as we get more and more advanced AI, we get more and more AI talking to AI, all sorts of
sort of beyond human, like any one individual, like as we move from, like, we're talking about a smart, kind of, human level, and you can kind of work through and sort of understand like how it's responded to your prompt. Instead, it becomes this kind of like von Neumann type character potentially, let's say, where it's like nobody really understands, like, he could, in theory, like go through his reasoning and outline how he came to a particular conclusion, but like probably is just going to give you some answer, and you're like, oh, I don't know where that came from.
And fundamentally, the problem is that like a computer cannot be responsible for making a decision, because a computer cannot be held responsible.
Yes. Now, this is like critically important, I think. Like not only like philosophically, but even practically, I would say. Right? Like
in America, we recently,
nobody's gonna like accept, oh well, my AI like fucked up, like gave you the wrong answer. Like if you're a lawyer, right? Like, oh, my AI was wrong. That's like, I don't give a shit like what kind of like models you're using here, mate. Like I'm paying worse, you
right? When you're talking about institutions in America, until recently, I think ProPublica had a thing on this. We had AI sentencing, right? Where like there was like an AI that was sentencing people in a proprietary model that people weren't even allowed to, like there was some private firm that was doing this black box, right? And it's like, so, and yeah, exactly. When it comes to race, right? Like, it's like, okay, well, how do you know that they're not just like, giving people sentences based on race? Like, you don't know, right? You don't know what the model is actually doing. But
unless you
look inside,
pay. Yeah. But anyway, sorry, go on.
But this, like, it's just, I think it's absurd to allow us to outsource the core human functions of society, of judging other people, of deciding how we should live our lives, to a computer, that we don't have any view into how it's making these decisions, that don't have any accountability. Now, I don't think that, I think if in the long run, if we solve all of these questions of like, how do we get large language models to respect human values? How do we get them to do what we want and not what we don't want? I think it's very reasonable to use these tools in the long run, but ultimately we need to be instilling like the correct values, the values that we actually care about into anything that we want to use in these sort of critical applications.
Sure. And I also think, the corollary to that in terms of instilling values into the models themselves is also to be much more deliberate in the way that we use them. Like instilling like values into the prompts, being much more conscious of like, okay, our capabilities in general are growing, and as they have for many centuries. And so that only makes it more important to be thinking about, well, what is it that we should be doing with them? Look, we're going to have to leave it there, but Anish Tondwalkar, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.